This right here is the single most broken thing ever introduced to the Splatoon series, and it's overshadowed a lot because for new players, it feels really awful. It's not a weapon or special or anything really obvious. Superjumping is much more subtle, somehow, despite essentially being a teleport. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's slow down a second. Superjumping as a base idea is honestly really smart. Splatoon as a series has a lot of hard problems to design around, mainly because a lot of the appeal of this game is just that its pacing is really fast. You need ways of keeping that pacing while still having exploitable flaws people can react to. One of the worst things in any shooter game is respawning. And I don't mean just the time you spend being dead, I mean especially the part where you are slowly walking from spawn to wherever the fight is actually taking place. There is so much downtime, but it feels like it has to exist. You have to reward people for getting kills. The original design behind Superjumping is to take this and add a high-risk, high-reward option. You can skip the entire walk back or swim back to the middle of the map by simply jumping to a teammate. It takes like 2 seconds and you're already back into the action. However, you then have this clear, visible, very obvious landing point attracting every single enemy player, bomb, and special weapon onto your location. And if you're caught there, you're just getting sent right back to the respawn barrier all over again. It's a very easy way to throw the game. It also makes superjumping an integral part of skill expression in this game. Being able to time your own super jumps properly, as well as have teammates who are capable of giving them, is really important. There's a lot of depth to it, such as pulling enemies away from landings or using positions that can help better hide the marker. And I think that's really cool. There's a much more dynamic reward on smart positioning. And this isn't just a thing that happens from spawn, obviously. Superjumping is a dynamic mobility tool that you have access to at all times. However, it didn't take good players very long to exploit this, and at first it seems like it was simply the game's balancing faults. Splatoon 1 was the first one to have superjumping be broken, and it's mostly thanks to the ability Stealth Jump. This was intended to be a trade-off ability. It made your super jump a whole 20% slower, making it much worse as an escape option and generally a bit slower to use, but came with the trade-off that you had no marker. Maybe this could have made more sense in a world where jumping out was more needed, to where the downside was actually important, but this was actually a game where you permanently cut down your respawn time to like 3 seconds, so you didn't really need to jump out. Dying and just coming back from respawn happened all the time, so you might as well have your landing be invisible there, which basically turned this into something with none of the risk and all of the reward. The only way to stop jumps like this was to look at the skybox and look for people falling down from all the way up there, which was obviously not something that 99% of the player base was going to do. In Splatoon 2, this did get fixed though. Stealth Jump was reworked to no longer have any sort of penalty or downside, but in exchange, rather than completely removing the marker, it now only hit it from a distance. We'll get to that a little bit more later. For now though, we have to talk about a different ability that gets buffed in this game. That is Quick Super Jump. This ability is really simple on paper. It just makes your super jump time faster. And while that applies to the entirety of the super jump, there's one aspect that is most important here, and that's the time it takes to leave the ground. Normally, this is an incredibly slow and impractical 80 frames, but Max Quick Super Jump lowers it down all the way to 20, which is insanely quick. However, that was basically something you never really saw, because it required almost a full gear set of Quick Super Jump, relegating it to the tier of YouTube meme build videos rather than any actual competitive play. What the devs decided to change in this game, however, is they made it better at stacking in lower quantities. One sub of Quick Super Jump after this change saved a whopping 22 frames, and if you added a second sub, it would save another 8. This cut down the amount of time it took before you left the ground by 37.5% for basically no gear investment. This made super jumping a more strong repositioning tool, allowing you to have much more scenarios in which you could safely jump out of the action to reposition to a teammate or go to your invincible spawn barrier and use a global range special like Stingray or Tandem missiles to get massive value. And this is where the problems arose. Suddenly you had a lot of defensive weapons or defensive specials which normally needed to be punished by players being able to run them down, which now had the ability to get out of those situations for free. 3. And Splatoon 2 specials and overall game design really heavily rewarded just staying alive, even if you were in less than optimal positions. And so because of that, it became a huge issue in this game. Positioning was just much less punishable, and defensive styles were way too rewarded. Once again, the next game would be tasked with fixing it. And to its credit, Splatoon 3 did tackle that. It revamped the spawn system entirely. No more invincible spawn shield, you could actually die over there. For the most part, we got rid of global range specials and at least made some of the ones that did exist weaker, and we created a game that prioritized forward movement and aggression, which meant that even if you did safely jump back to spawn, you had less things to do over there, and being out of the action made it a lot worse of an option. Despite that though, Splatoon 3 would be the game where super jumping became arguably more broken than either of the other two, and there's two main reasons for this. First off, like I said before, the game is very aggressive, so it prioritizes a lot of weapons that also happen to be good at fighting upon landing from a super jump. There's plenty of options that I can talk about here. There's things like dualies that have their rolls out of it, Splatanas can dash and have a one-shot up close, rollers can hit you on their landing, blasters and buckets can land with a high damage option on their landings, and worst of all, you had weapons like Mid Decapitator, a weapon with a far dash and a giant hitbox on its slash. This being so large that Mid could actually jump in further than you can even see the landing, and it can still go all the way over to kill you and protect its own landing with its dash. Because of how often these weapons are present and how often people are running into each other in Splatoon 3, this has become more common than it's ever been in the past. Now, this has always been an issue with Stealth Jump having too small a range since Splatoon 2, but it's exploited far often by the tools in Splatoon 3. However, the reason this is so common is not just because of Stealth Jump, but because of a much larger factor. Players had constant access to a 20-frame super jump because of the special Tacticooler. Tacticooler, a lot like super jumping, is an overall cool idea. A throwable special that buffs your teammates, and for the most part, I really like what these do. There was one ability that a lot of people were worried about, and that was Special Saver. For a while, people thought this would be the most broken thing with Tacticooler, retaining your entire special. But it turns out one of them is far stronger, and that is Quick Super Jump. You get max QSJ effect from this, meaning that for the entire duration of the buff, usually around 20 seconds, you have a 20-frame jump. For slower AoE weapons like blasters and sloshers, they got the most out of this. These weapons could go in, use their giant hitboxes to try and get damage, and where they would normally be punished and immediately shot back for doing so, could now cancel the end lag by immediately inputting a super jump back to their teammates. This skips a slow movement option that can normally be punished and gives you an instant repositioning tool. And remember, since these players also have Stealth Jump, they have a landing that can only be seen up close, which already leads to the problem I talked about earlier. This means that super jumping under these conditions is no longer a high risk, high reward option. In many cases, this is now the least risky thing you can do. And it applies to more weapons besides these, just to be clear. Anchors being able to instantly escape, and mobility weapons that are no longer punished when pinned down because they can just get out. But the most overlooked aspect of what makes this so broken is, once again, cooler. At least when you finally take out a Tacticooler player, they lose the special. QSJing like this allows you to keep the buffs through far more situations than you reasonably should survive, which encourages repeating the entire process. A constant cycle of players going in, pulling attention, and jumping out of situations that they would by no other means survive. The problem with super jumping is just that the modifiers for it inherently mess with the risk factor way too much. It's something too integral to its design, and having factors like a 20-frame jump out and only having jumps be visible in a range where you're stuck fighting them anyway is just so radically different than how super jumping is normally that it messes with it too much. Now, I don't have a problem with super jumping being made stronger or having abilities that influence it, but it needs to be done in a way that keeps more of the inherent downsides to the special. And I think there are two factors we can do to fix this problem. The first of which is stealth jump. While having the marker be visible from only a certain range is a good idea, the current distance is just too short, and the solution is pretty simple. The range should be a good bit larger so that it's visible from around mid-range, and people can take fights with it only if they see them. While not necessary, I also think the ability was more interesting when it had a downside. I would like to reintroduce the 20% penalty it had, but instead make it so that it only affects the time spent in the air. This makes the action of super jumping and its regrouping capabilities slower, increasing the ability for opponents to try to punish jumps before they land, and creating more overall downtime. To adjust it as an escape option, I think the problem is more with cooler. I think that 50 frames is still plenty of time to punish it when it's just being stacked normally, and instead what they should do is reduce the max effect of Tacticooler. I think that instead of having max QSJ, it should be anywhere from 30 to 35 frames before you leave the ground. That's still a good bit faster than quick super jump with a few subs added onto it, but it's nowhere near as crazy as the amount right now, making it more comparable to the normal end lag options for other slower weapons and giving more of an opportunity where it could be punished. This also once again makes the action of super jumping slower and more likely that people can get around to punishing it. Super jumping as a mechanic I still find overall very smart and creative. It's a unique movement tool, and I'm glad it's getting more of a spotlight in combat and positioning, but I think there needs to be a better focus on keeping the ability more nuanced and the inherent risk that makes it so interesting in the first place. This is an important change that I feel is necessary for how the game is played, especially at a top level, and I really hope we can see some adjustments in the future.